Next, we have Professor Grewal, who is a professor of women's gender and sexuality. She also studies, in addition to gender and sexuality, intersectionality as well as transnationalism. Her research and teaching aims are to understand the racial and gendered histories of European and U.S. colonialism that remain sedimented in our lives and animate global, national, and local politics of the world. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. And I take inspiring Yale to be my students who inspire me. I've had the most inspiring students in my career here at Yale, and I'm so grateful for what I've learned for them. So let me share with you some of what I've learned and some of what we're doing at Yale in the humanities. Humanities is commonly understood as the study of language, literature, art, and history, right? Popular culture and its new forms. But it's also about studying the present and the past. In my mind, the past and the present. It's the study of the imagination and of desires, our attempts to forge and think about and imagine new futures. So as someone who works and trained in the humanities, my degree was in English literature. It's always a surprise to those who know me. Is that I can respond to the question of why the humanities, what's its relevance today, in three kinds of answers. First, it remains important to work in the humanities because knowledge is not easily compartmentalized. And that which may seem useful or utilitarian may, in some cases, though not all, simply be ideological and instrumental, right? Thus, thinking historically about knowledge is critical. The second reason, humanities must change and is changing to move away from a narrowly provincialized Western model or a textualized understanding of bounded cultures and nations and move into a world of transnational connections, of aesthetic forms that circulate, originating from all kinds of places, coming into friction and contact with each other, forms that circulate across new media platforms and old media ones too. These are worlded, as we call them. They are amended. They have become hybrid in continual ways, often carrying with them the histories, the aesthetics, and the pleasures outside the imaginations of any narrowly conceived notion of the individual or the subject. And third, I think now, more than ever, we need a humanities that enables us to struggle for rights and social justice, that interrogates critically whose humanity matters and whose does not, while going beyond the human to think about cosmologies and unities that encompass living with and alongside the non-human. These three elements, I think, are critical for what I think of as a decolonized humanities. So much of what we think of as the humanities has become thought of in terms of provincial knowledges produced by histories of provincialism, by this I mean that a great deal of literature, language, and culture is compartmentalized. It's understood through comparative projects that are always seen to be dramatically and absolutely different from each other. The East is different from the West. Nation states are bounded. Religion is separate from culture. Culture is separate from race. Race and gender and civilizations are all bounded entities. This is what we've come to think of as normative, right? Masculinity is the opposite of femininity, and on and on and on. These knowledges become real and material. Knowledge formation has consequences. While we argue, for instance, and I think my colleague have said this to you today, that while we think there's no such thing as race in science, race flourishes in all the institutions of our lives today, right? Black and white are understood as clear conceptual categories. For instance, Charles Murray makes a living producing these ideas, and he has much power and resource behind him. So boundaries, walls, and borders continue to be seen as the bedrock of knowledge in the humanities. With boundaries and walls, however, come guards, police, and checkpoints. I try to think about these in my work by doing what I call transnational cultural studies in a feminist way, by thinking about the politics of knowledge and how that knowledge produces politics. Right? I hope to question the tidy spatial separations of the nation states, even in the post-colonial studies in which I was trained, right? In which people tried to think about how to decolonize knowledge, how to decolonize our worlds, right? We assume then that nation states then do not define cultures, that cultures and cultural ideas are widely dispersed, disseminate. Nations are constituted by what's outside them as much as by what's inside them. The international makes the domestic and vice versa. For instance, it's only by insisting against all evidence that the hijab, wearing Muslim woman is subjugated, that we can see images like these and we can understand the meanings that they convey. This is Claire Danes from an advertisement for the television series called Homeland. What sense does this kind of image mean? I try to think about how it is that whiteness and blackness are juxtaposed in this image to show the free Western white woman and the dark, the back of the hijab-wearing woman, other woman, right? And what it is, when we see an image like this, where the hijab-wearing woman then becomes normalized into only because she's wearing the American flag. How do we understand these kinds of political formations, which are deeply meaningful to us because they come to us from knowledges produced by Western colonization across the world itself? These kinds of comparisons can happen all the time. They are performed and reiterated over and over and again. Something a friend of mine calls the burqa cam. You see these images of women in burqas all the time in our culture, right? And they happen all the time despite the ways in which we think about inequalities for women in America as well, and the kind of misogyny in the Trump campaign has been remarkable and striking and traumatizing for many, right? There are now many models of thinking outside the provincialized humanities to what I think of as a more transnational and decolonized version. Scholars study the connections across Asia and the ancient world, who think not of the classical or the classic, but also the abjected, the deviant, the neglected, the hidden, the silenced, the popular, the everyday, the animal. All the scholars think about, produce spatialized imaginations for knowledges that encompass diasporas, oceans, roads, networks, South-South connections. Those who think about how compartmentalization of knowledge serves and does not serve us, right? Why is it productive? Why does it continue? Why is science separate from technology, philosophy from religion, religion from culture? Who questions how the human came to be defined in Christian terms? Or who we ask why racial or lower caste or indigenous bodies meant that they were seen to be disposable or non-human. I argued then for a mobile epistemology as central to a study in the humanities, of the refugee and the migrant as the paradigmatic normative figure of our times, right? To understand the contemporary world in which those displaced, the migrant, the refugees, are not just evidence of failures or are deviant or are out of place, but that they are the norm for our time today. Thus, all to think about all that seems to be moving as not suspicious, but as normative, right? And our epistemologies work have to be thinking in mobile ways, right? What we call it, what some scholars call a sedentarist metaphysics needs to be changed into a mobile one. Just to think all that seemed fixed was actually mobile. Nationalisms were created in diasporas, civilizations that thrived in connection with each other, histories of multicultural in ancient and modern worlds that contradict assumption that homogeneity is normal, that what seemed bounded and territorialized was actually dispersed, porous, circulating. right? That sedimentary metaphysics are walls that constrain our knowledges and disciplines are maintained by checkpoints and police. I want to just end with examples of this. This is the Mercator map that we've been used to seeing. How do we change the ways we see the world and see ourselves in the world? So the old map sort of centers our vision on a kind of spatiality, allows us to look at the world in a certain way. A different new map would put Africa in the center, South America also in the center, right? A map of India, recently used, often used in India, sort of produces space as a paradigmatically Hindu space, belonging to one community, not to a heterogeneity that lived in that space, right? This is how artists rethink spatiality. They think about borders and boundaries and partitions as deeply steeped in red and in blood, right? The divisions themselves are deeply disturbing and producing violence, right? We think of the world as of movement, a world of movement, of connections, of cross-cutting cultures, of always changing forms of culture as well. The Indian Ocean as a history of trade that many of us have forgotten, that we're trying to think through, and there's so much knowledge and work that remains to be done to think of these ancient worlds in quite different ways, right? To think of other kinds of connections and how those connections forge cultures that we've now compartmentalized into nation states, very bounded ideas of cultures and nations, right? Another way to think about this is the 20th century has become dramatically shaped by all of these movements, not just of finance and trade, but of people, of labor, of cultural changes that are formed by histories of contact. I want to end with an old cartoon strip from Zippy the Pinhead. I don't know how many of you remember Bill Griffith and Zippy the Pinhead. And he always had this kind of freaky, strange imagination. And this cartoon was produced way before the 1989. And so it has Yugoslavia still mentioned in it. But it's something to look at. Griffey, why does the world have its head to the north and its feet to the south? It's a Western European concept, Zip, designed to keep the white boys on top. You mean Zimbabwe isn't below Yugoslavia? North and south and up and down are merely agreed upon concepts, just castles in the air. Thank you.